She spent her last 12 cents on 11 chickens that were already dying. Every person in Iron Hollow watched her carry those birds home in a busted crate, feathers falling out, legs twisted wrong, eyes half shut with disease. They watched and they laughed. Not unkind laughter exactly, just the tired, honest laughter of people who had seen too many desperate choices made by folks with nothing left to lose. Ruth Mercer Crowe, 31 years old, standing in the mud outside Harlan Putt's trading post, with a crate full of dying birds and 12 fewer cents to her name. Her husband Elias hadn't said a word the whole walk home. That silence was its own kind of verdict. But here is what nobody standing on that street understood. Ruth wasn't buying chickens. She was buying a problem that nobody else believed could be solved, and she intended to prove every single one of them wrong. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Ruth bought the chickens, the temperature had dropped 11 degrees by noon, and the wind off the northern flats carried the particular cruelty that Iron Hollow residents called a dry bite. Cold that didn't feel cold until your face stopped hurting and went numb instead. She had walked the half-mile into the settlement's main strip alone because Elias was out trying to patch the western fence line before the ground froze solid and made the job impossible until March. She had gone into town with 22 cents, which was everything they had that wasn't already promised to someone. She'd meant to buy salt, maybe a paper of needles if enough was left over. Practical things. Necessary things. The kind of purchases that kept a homestead alive by inches rather than miles. But then she'd walked past Harlan Putt's lot and seen the crate. Harlan was out front, which was unusual for him. He was a man who preferred the inside of his store to the outside of anything, and he had the crate set up on an old barrel where people could see it. 11 chickens. Rhode Island Reds, or what had been Rhode Island Reds before whatever illness or misfortune had reduced them to their current condition. A hand-painted sign leaned against the barrel. 12 cents. Take all or none. Final offer. Ruth had stopped walking. She wasn't sure why exactly. Later she would try to explain it to Elias, and the words wouldn't come out right, would sound either too grand or too foolish. What she saw was not 11 dying chickens. What she saw was 11 problems that every other person in Iron Hollow had already decided were unsolvable. And something in her, some stubborn, contrary piece of her that her mother had always called her worst quality, and her worst quality only, wouldn't let her walk past an unsolved problem without at least looking at it straight. "What's wrong with them?" she asked Harlan. He shrugged the way a man shrugs when he's already given up on something and doesn't want to spend more energy discussing it. "Respiratory, I figure. Started with 2 of them, spread through the whole flock. Mites probably on top of that. The leg on that one there," he pointed at a bird huddled in the back corner of the crate, "got twisted somehow, don't know how. Came that way when I bought them off the Delacroix widow back in September." "September," Ruth said. "You've been trying to move them since September." "Nobody wants sick chickens, Mrs. Crowe." 12 cents for all 11. "I'd sooner give them away free than deal with the paperwork of 11 separate deaths," Harlan said, which wasn't entirely a joke. 12 cents covers my trouble. You want them or not?" She looked at the crate for another long moment. She thought about salt. She thought about the way the meat supply had been running thin and how Elias had started eating less without saying anything about it, the way he always did when he was trying to spare her from worry. She thought about the fence and the winter ahead and the land that still owed them everything they'd poured into it. Then she counted out 12 cents and picked up the crate. The walk home took 25 minutes on a good day. With a crate of sick chickens and the wind working against her, it took nearly 40. By the time she turned up the rutted path toward their claim, her arms were burning, and she had mentally rehearsed the conversation with Elias at least 6 times in 6 different ways, none of which ended cleanly. He was still at the fence when she arrived, driving stakes with a methodical patience that she had always admired in him. Not because the work was pleasant, which it wasn't, but because Elias Crowe approached problems the same way whether he liked them or not. He looked up when he heard her coming. His eyes went to the crate. His face did the thing it sometimes did where his expression held absolutely still while he processed something that surprised him. "What," he said, "is that?" It wasn't really a question. He could see what it was. 11 chickens, Ruth said. She set the crate down on the flat stone near the porch steps and straightened up, working the stiffness out of her lower back. Elias walked over slowly. He crouched and looked through the wooden slats of the crate without touching it. The chickens inside were mostly still, which wasn't a good sign in birds that should have been moving. One of them made a wet, rattling sound when it breathed. "Ruth," he said, "I know. These birds are—" "I know, Elias." He stood up. He took off his hat and held it against his chest, the way he did when he was either praying or trying very hard not to say something he'd regret. Elias Crow was 36 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered into something that looked older than it was by 3 years of frontier weather. And before that, 2 years of war that he still didn't talk about in any detail. He had a scar that ran from his left ear down to his jawline, a thin white seam that Ruth had traced with her finger so many times it felt like part of the landscape of him. "How much?" he said finally. 12 cents. Something moved across his face. Not anger. She knew what Elias's anger looked like, and this wasn't it. It was closer to a kind of exhausted grief, the expression of a man adding one more difficult number to a column that was already running wrong. "That was our last money," he said. "Yes. We don't have salt." "No." "Or needles." "No." He looked at the crate again. He looked at her. "So you bought 11 chickens that are probably going to be dead before the week's out." "Maybe," Ruth said. "Or maybe not." The silence between them stretched. A gust of wind came off the flats and rattled the loose shutter on the north side of the house, the one Elias had been meaning to fix since October. "What's your plan?" he asked. And that was the thing about Elias Crow. The thing Ruth had understood about him before she'd agreed to marry him, and before they'd come out to this godforsaken piece of land together. He didn't give up on her. He got quiet sometimes, and he got careful with his words. But he didn't give up. Even now, looking at 11 near-dead chickens that represented the last 12 cents they owned, his question wasn't, "Why did you do this?" or "What were you thinking?" It was, "What's your plan?" As if the plan was already assumed. As if the only remaining question was the shape of it. Ruth picked up the crate. "Help me get them inside the barn," she said. "I'll explain while we work." Dab. They didn't have a barn exactly. What they had was a structure that had been a barn once, probably, under some previous occupant of the claim, before weather and neglect had reduced it to something that served the function of a barn if you didn't look at it too carefully. 3 walls were solid. The fourth had a gap near the roofline that Elias had stuffed with old sacking and rope to keep the worst of the wind out. The floor was hard-packed dirt. It was cold in there, but not as cold as outside, and the absence of wind made the difference between survivable and not. Ruth had been keeping a small store of things in the corner of the barn that she'd been collecting, quietly, for months. Dried herbs from the kitchen garden, yarrow, sage, a bundle of something that the Kessler woman 2 claims over had told her was good for respiratory ailments in animals, a sack of clean wood ash, several old canvas feed bags she'd requested from Harlan Putt when he was throwing them out, a tin of rendered fat. Elias looked at the collection when she led him to it. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked. "I haven't been planning anything specific," Ruth said. "I've been preparing in case something like this came up. Something like 11 dying chickens. Something like an opportunity other people had thrown away." He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh before he swallowed it back. "You are the strangest woman I have ever known," he said, but his voice had lost the tightness it had carried out at the fence, and she knew the worst of the conversation was over. They set up the crate near the corner where the draft was least. Ruth pulled on the heavy work gloves she kept hanging from a nail near the door and opened the crate carefully, one bird at a time. The examination was methodical and unpleasant. She handled each chicken the way her grandmother had taught her, back in Pennsylvania before everything changed. Firm, but not rough, keeping the bird's wings controlled against its body so it couldn't thrash and hurt itself or her. She checked eyes, nostrils, the skin under the feathers, the feet, the legs, the crop. She set each bird down in the sectioned area she and Elias had quickly assembled from old boards while she worked, separating them not randomly, but by what she observed. 3 birds appeared to have primarily respiratory involvement. The wet breathing, the discharge around the nostrils, the lethargy that came from lungs that weren't working right. 4 more had the respiratory symptoms plus mite infestation, which she could see in the damaged feathers and the way they kept raking their bills along their wings, trying to reach the irritation. Two seemed physically weakest, underweight to the point where their keels, the breastbone ridge, were sharp as blades under her fingers, suggesting they'd been losing to the others at feeding time for a long time. One had an injury to its left leg, old enough to have partially healed wrong, leaving the bird with a permanent tilt to its gait, but not, she thought, in active pain. The 11th bird was the surprise. It sat in the corner of the temporary pen and watched her with eyes that were clear and alert, even as the others huddled in their misery around it. It wasn't well. Its feathers were in poor condition, and its weight was low. But something about it was simply present in a way the others weren't. Ruth pointed at it. "That one's going to pull the others through," she said. Elias, who had been watching her work with his arms folded and an expression of careful attention, looked at the bird. "How do you know that?" "I don't know it," she said. "I believe it. There's a difference." She looked at the bird for another moment. "That one has something the others don't." "What?" "The will to be alive." The first week was brutal. Not because the work was harder than expected. Ruth had expected hard. But because the dying was faster than she'd hoped. The first morning, she found one of the severe respiratory cases dead in the corner of the pen. She removed it without ceremony and buried it behind the barn in ground that hadn't frozen solid yet, though it was close. She did not tell the neighbors. She didn't want to give them anything more to say. The mite treatment was her grandmother's method, the one she'd seen applied to ailing chickens twice in her childhood. Wood ash worked thoroughly into the feathers and against the skin. Then a mixture of the rendered fat and crushed dried sage applied to the worst affected areas. It wasn't pleasant work. The birds didn't enjoy it and said so, loudly, in that particular way of chickens who had decided that cooperation was not in their nature. She came out of the barn most evenings smelling of ash and livestock, her hair clinging to her face from the effort, her hands raw. Elias helped when he could. The fence had to be finished, and the root cellar needed attention, and there were a dozen other demands on a man trying to keep a homestead running through the approach of winter. But in the evenings, after supper, he'd come into the barn with her and hold a bird while she worked, or help with the feeding, or simply sit on an overturned bucket and keep her company while she made her notes by lantern light. She'd started the notebook on the second day. It had begun as a simple record, which birds had been treated, how, when, but it evolved quickly into something more detailed. She noted what each bird ate and how much. She noted which feeding methods produced the most interest from the sickest animals. She noted behavioral changes, the day one of the mite-heavy birds stopped raking at its feathers and simply rested instead, which turned out to be the beginning of its improvement rather than the beginning of the end. She noted which birds ate better when separated from the group and which ones needed the proximity of others to feel safe enough to eat at all. "You're writing more than you're sleeping," Elias observed one night. "I'm sleeping enough." "You were up at 2 this morning." She looked up from the notebook. "I heard one of the respiratory ones making a different sound. I wanted to check on it." "And?" "Better, I think. The sound is changing, less wet." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moaning along the edge of the roof. "Ruth," he said, "what happens if this doesn't work?" She understood what he was asking, not just about the chickens, about all of it. The winter ahead, the salt they didn't have, the way the numbers on their homestead claim never seemed to come out right no matter how carefully she ran them. "Then we know it doesn't work," she said, "and we try something else." "That's not really an answer." "No," she agreed, "but it's the only one I have." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he accepted something without fully liking it. Then he got up and went to look at the alert bird, the one she'd pointed out on the first day, which was sitting in its section of the pen with that same clear-eyed presence it had carried from the beginning. "Has this one got a name?" he asked. "She's a chicken, Elias. I'm aware of what she is." Ruth looked at the bird. It looked back at her with a steadiness that she found, against her better judgment, genuinely remarkable. "No," she said, "she doesn't have a name." "I'm going to call her Penny," Elias said. "That's a ridiculous name for a chicken." "It is," he agreed. He scratched the bird gently under the chin, which she tolerated with the air of something accepting tribute. "Still going to call her that, though." The settlement of Iron Hollow had grown up fast, the way frontier settlements did. fast and provisional, as if nobody entirely believed it was going to last and wanted to make sure they could leave quickly if they needed to. The main strip had a trading post, Harlan Putt's place, and a farrier's building, and a structure that served as meeting hall and occasionally as a space for the traveling judge when circuit court came through. There were maybe 60 families within a half-day's ride of the settlement center, some of them doing well enough, some of them struggling the way Ruth and Elias were struggling, a few of them barely there at all. Social life in Iron Hollow moved through the women, which was true of most frontier settlements. The men did the visible work, the building, the negotiating, the occasional violence, but the information, the opinions, the quiet judgments about who was managing well and who was failing traveled through the women's networks with a speed and accuracy that would have impressed a military telegraph operator, which meant that within 3 days of Ruth's purchase, everyone knew about the chickens. Dorothea Hark heard it from Mabel Stetson, who'd been in Putt's store when the transaction happened, and had watched the whole thing from beside the dry goods shelf. Dorothea told Frances Loch. Frances told her daughter Corinne, who told anyone who'd listen, because Corinne Loch was 19 and had recently developed an unfortunate fondness for being the person who knew things first. Ruth became aware of her new notoriety on her second trip into the settlement, when she went to see if Harlan Putt would extend credit against their spring claim for a small amount of salt. The store had 3 other women in it when she arrived, and the quality of the silence that fell when she entered told her everything she needed to know about what had been said before she got there. She bought the salt. Harlan gave her the credit without much negotiation, which suggested he felt some obscure guilt about the chicken transaction, which she thought was probably fair. And on the way out, she passed Dorothea Hark on the steps. Dorothea was a solid, sharp-faced woman of about 50, who had been on the frontier longer than almost anyone else in the settlement and had opinions about everything and shared them freely. She was not cruel exactly, but she was blunt in the way of people who have decided that honesty is a virtue and have never entirely examined whether timing matters as much as content. "I heard about those chickens," Dorothea said. "I imagine you did," Ruth said. 12 cents for 11 sick birds. That right?" "That's right." Dorothea looked at her for a moment with an expression that was almost sympathy, but hadn't quite gotten there. "Ruth, those birds are dying. You know that." "Some of them died already," Ruth said. She watched Dorothea's expression shift. "Some of them are still here. I'm working on improving that ratio." "Working how?" "Carefully," Ruth said. She kept walking. Behind her, she heard Dorothea make a sound that was probably meant to be heard. A low, skeptical exhale that served as commentary without words. Ruth didn't turn around, but she registered it. She registered all of it. The looks in the store, Dorothea's tone, the stories that Corinne Loff was circulating. She registered them the way she registered everything that mattered, stored them somewhere in the back of her mind where she kept the things she intended to be useful later. Well, 3 weeks after the purchase, she had 9 birds. She'd lost a second one in the second week, another respiratory case that had never turned the corner the way she'd hoped despite everything she'd tried. 9 out of 11 wasn't a triumph, not yet, but it was something better than the nothing that everyone had predicted. The survivors were beginning to show changes. The mite-affected birds' feathers were coming back in patches. Not beautiful yet, uneven and rough-looking, but new growth was new growth. 2 of the underweight birds had gained visible mass through the ribs and keel. Their movement was different too, less the dragging, reluctant motion of animals that are primarily occupied with dying, and more the irritable, investigative movement of birds that have remembered they have opinions about things. Penny remained what she had been from the beginning, alert, watchful, present. But she had also begun something that Ruth had not anticipated and could not entirely explain. She seemed to calm the others. When Ruth introduced new feed combinations that made the flock uncertain, Penny was the first to approach and eat, and the others followed. When a gust of wind rattled the barn walls and sent several birds into a brief panic, Penny simply stood in place until the noise passed, and the ones near her stilled faster than the ones farther away. "She's showing them it's safe," Elias said one evening, watching. "Animals do that," Ruth said. "People too," Elias said quietly, and she understood that he wasn't talking about chickens anymore. She kept writing in the notebook. Feeding schedules, observations, measurements where she could make them. She began comparing what she was seeing against what she'd expected to see based on everything she'd ever been told about keeping chickens. Things her grandmother had said, things Elias's mother had done back in Ohio, things she'd absorbed without knowing she was absorbing them through years of watching women manage livestock before she'd ever had livestock of her own. Some of what she observed matched what she'd expected. A good deal of it didn't. That gap between what was supposed to happen and what was actually happening interested her more than almost anything else. The first person who came to ask questions directly was not who Ruth expected. Margaret Elroy was 43 years old, a widow who had been managing her family's claim alone since her husband had died of a fever 3 summers back. She had 2 grown sons who helped when they weren't working their own land, and a reputation in Iron Hollow for practicality so absolute that it was occasionally mistaken for coldness. She was not a gossip. She was not particularly warm. But she was, Ruth had always thought, genuinely intelligent in the way of someone who never stopped paying attention. She arrived one morning in late November without sending word ahead, which was her way. Ruth was in the barn when she heard the knock on the post at the door. Margaret wouldn't have called out, that would have been too much announcement, and turned to find the woman standing there with her coat buttoned to the throat and her eyes already moving across the space, taking inventory. "Mrs. Elroy," Ruth said. "Ruth." Margaret stepped inside without waiting to be invited, which was also her way. She looked at the birds. She looked at the divided sections of the pen. She looked at the notebook sitting open on the barrel Ruth used as a work table. "They look better than I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Honestly, I expected they'd all be dead by now." She said it without apology, because Margaret Elroy had made peace a long time ago with the fact that reality didn't improve by being softened. "I heard Harlan sold you 11 birds in September that were already failing. These," she nodded at the pen, "these don't look like failing birds." "They're not anymore," Ruth said, "or most of them aren't." Margaret turned and looked at her directly for the first time. She had dark eyes, sharp and unreadable. "What did you do?" Ruth explained. Not quickly. She'd learned that quick explanations of careful work usually sounded either miraculous or idiotic, and hers was neither. But thoroughly, working through the treatment approach, the feeding adjustments, the separation and recombination of birds based on what she'd observed about their individual needs. She showed Margaret the notebook without being asked, opening it to the pages of daily observations, the charts she'd started keeping of weight and behavior. Margaret looked at the notebook for a long time. "You documented all of this," she said, "every day, sometimes twice a day." "Why?" Ruth considered the question. "Because if it worked, I wanted to know exactly what worked. And if it failed, I wanted to know what I'd tried so I wouldn't try the same failed things again." Margaret set the notebook down. She looked at Penny, who was watching both women with her characteristic composure. The dark one with the notch in her comb. "She's the one who leads the others." "She does," Ruth said, mildly surprised. "You noticed that quickly. She's standing in the middle of the pen and the others are arranged around her. That's not random. That's social structure." Margaret paused. "My late husband used to say chickens were stupid animals. He said it about most animals, though. I don't think he was right." "I don't think he was either." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable. Outside, a cold wind moved across the claim and the sacking over the gap in the fourth wall bulged inward and then stilled. "I have 22 laying hens," Margaret said finally. "Production's been down since August. I've been trying to understand why and not getting anywhere useful." Ruth looked at her. "Bring me your numbers, if you have them. What they were eating, when production changed, what else changed around that time?" Margaret's expression shifted slightly. Not quite to warmth, but to something that acknowledged a transaction had been entered into. "I'll bring them next week," she said. She left without ceremony, pulling her coat tight against the November air. Ruth stood in the barn doorway watching her go, and then turned back to the notebook and added a new entry at the bottom of the day's page. "M. Elroy, 22 laying hens, production decline since August. Arranged to review her records. First outside inquiry." She underlined the last 2 words. December brought a hardening of everything: the ground, the air, the small daily calculations that governed what they ate and when and how much. Ruth and Elias lived through December the way you live through something that has to be survived rather than enjoyed, making each decision with the careful economy of people who know that the margin between enough and not enough is narrower than it has any right to be. But the chickens thrived. Not spectacularly. Not yet. Not in the way that she was beginning to believe was possible, but solidly, consistently, in the direction of health rather than away from it. By the third week of December, all 9 remaining birds had feathers that covered them properly. All 9 were eating with appetite. All 9 moved around their increasingly crowded quarters with something that in a healthier animal you would have called vigor. She started adjusting their feed in the third week of December. She'd been thinking about it since the second week, working through the logic. If the mite treatment and the respiratory care and the attentive feeding had gotten them to this point, the next question was whether the quality of the feed itself could push them further. She had limited materials to work with: grain, some dried kitchen scraps, the last of the dried herbs from her garden store. But she began experimenting with proportions and combinations, noting the results in the notebook with the same careful attention she'd applied to everything else. She was in the barn on a Thursday morning, making notes from the previous evening's feeding observation, when Elias came in with a face that told her he'd heard something in town. "What?" she said without looking up. "Francis Loff is telling people you're practicing some kind of witchcraft on those birds." Ruth set down her pen. She looked at him. "Francis Loff is an idiot. She's also influential." "She's influential and an idiot. That combination is more common than it should be." Ruth picked her pen back up. "What exactly is she saying? That you've got them eating something unnatural. That no sick bird recovers like this without some kind of interference that decent people ought to be suspicious of." "The interference is called attention," Ruth said flatly. "And careful feeding, and not giving up on something just because it's inconvenient." "I know that," Elias said. "I'm just telling you what's being said." She put the pen down again and really looked at him this time. He was standing with his arms folded, his expression holding that careful stillness that she'd learned to read as concern he was trying not to show. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there in the fall. Winter was wearing on him in the particular way it wore on men who worked with their bodies, a grinding accumulation of cold and effort and inadequate rest. "Elias," she said, "are you worried? About what people are saying?" "No." He paused. "About whether this is going to amount to anything before spring?" "Yes, a little." "It's going to amount to something," she said. "How do you know?" "Because I know what I'm seeing in those birds, and I know what this notebook tells me about the trajectory they're on." She gestured at the birds in the pen, who were going about their bird business with the cheerful indifference of animals that had fully recovered their sense of entitlement. "Something is happening here that I haven't seen before, and I don't think it's an accident." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he uncrossed his arms and came over and looked at the notebook over her shoulder, the way he sometimes did when she was working. Not reading it exactly, just orienting himself to where she was in her thinking. "How much longer do you need?" he said. "To know for certain?" "To have something to show for it." She thought about this honestly. "Another month," she said. "Maybe 6 weeks." He nodded. He kissed the top of her head, which was something he did without making a production of it, just a matter-of-fact gesture that was somehow more reassuring than any of the words people deployed in the same situation. Then he went back out into the cold. Ruth turned back to the notebook. December 19th. Feed adjustment. Increased grain proportion. Added dried sage to morning mix. Birds responsive. Penny eating well. The underweight pair are no longer the smallest birds in the flock. The leg injury bird has fallen slightly behind in weight, which bears watching, but behavior remains strong. She paused, then added, "Elias asked how much longer. I said a month. I believe this is true. I also believe that what these birds are becoming is something I have not yet fully understood. I need to see it through to know what I have." She closed the notebook and went to check on Penny, who regarded her arrival with the patient tolerance of something that had decided to permit this relationship on its own terms. "A month," Ruth told her. Penny blinked slowly. "Don't look at me like that," Ruth said. "I know what I'm doing." She wasn't entirely sure she did, but she was going to find out. The last week of December brought 3 things: a blizzard that kept them inside for 4 days, a letter from Elias's sister in Ohio that contained more worry than news, and the quiet but unmistakable arrival of something Ruth had not expected to feel. She had expected the work with the chickens to be utilitarian, a problem to be solved, a resource to be recovered from waste. She had not expected to become interested in the birds as individual creatures, to find herself sitting in the barn in the early morning before Elias was awake, not working exactly, but watching, following the logic of their social arrangements and their individual personalities with something that was closer to curiosity than anything practically useful. Penny remained the axis around which everything else organized itself, but the others had clarified into distinct presences. The two formerly underweight birds, who had developed what Ruth could only describe as an aggressive enthusiasm for food that was probably a legacy of early scarcity. The leg injury bird, whose tilted gait had apparently been accepted by the flock as simply a feature of that particular chicken rather than a disqualification. The four who had recovered from the worst mite damage and now seemed, paradoxically, to have the healthiest feathers in the flock, as if the treatment had done something more than simply remove a problem. She wrote about all of this in the notebook. She didn't know yet what it meant. She suspected it meant something. The blizzard cleared on New Year's Eve and left Iron Hollow buried under 18 inches of new snow, still and white and brutally cold. Ruth stood on the porch that night and watched the stars come out over the plain, vast and indifferent and so numerous that they defied any single response to them. Behind her through the door she could hear Elias moving around the kitchen, putting things away. The barn was dark, but she could hear, or imagined she could hear, the small sounds of the birds settling in for the night, the shuffling and low murmurs of creatures that had survived something and knew it. She stood there for a while in the cold. Then she went back inside. January came in mean, not the dramatic howling mean of the December blizzard. That kind of cold had its own honesty to it, announced itself, demanded respect. January's cold was different. It was the kind that settled in without making a fuss, a steady, grinding chill that seeped into the walls of the house and sat there for weeks, making every morning feel like the morning before it had been colder than it actually was. The kind of cold that broke things gradually. Fence posts shifted. Water barrels cracked along old seams. Animals that had come through December fine began to falter in January because December had spent them in ways that didn't show up until the bills came due. Ruth was awake before first light most mornings now. She couldn't have told anyone exactly when that had started. Somewhere in the weeks of tending the birds, her sleep had reorganized itself around their schedule rather than any schedule of her own. She was up before Elias, which was unusual. He was a man who woke early out of long habit, but she was beginning to beat him to it by a margin that she suspected bothered him slightly, though he hadn't said anything. The 9 birds were doing what Ruth had started to think of, privately, as consolidating. They weren't in recovery anymore. Recovery implied returning to some previous state, and what she was observing in the pen each morning was something she was increasingly certain those birds had never been before, not even when they were healthy. Their feathers carried a density and sheen that she hadn't seen in ordinary farm stock. Their manner was different too, harder to articulate but visible in the way they moved through the space, the quality of their attention when she entered the barn. She mentioned this to Elias on a Sunday morning while they were eating what passed for breakfast that week. Cornbread that was mostly corn and not much else, and the last of the salt pork, which had run further than she'd expected it to and was now running out. "I think what's happening to them is more than recovery," she said. Elias looked up from his plate. He had that expression he sometimes wore when she said things that surprised him. Not skeptical exactly, but holding the idea at a slight distance while he examined it. "What do you mean, more than recovery?" "I mean the way they look, the way they're eating, the weight they're carrying. I've seen healthy chickens my whole life, Elias. These birds look different from healthy chickens." "Different how?" She thought about it for a moment. Like the sickness was the worst thing that ever happened to them, and surviving it made them something the sickness didn't intend. He was quiet. He looked out the small kitchen window at the gray January sky. "That's either very true or very optimistic," he said, "and I'm not always sure with you which one I'm dealing with." "Both, probably," she said. He nodded slowly. "Both is fine," he said. "Both got us to January with 9 birds when everyone expected 0. She let that sit there between them for a moment, the small warmth of it, before she got up to clear the plates. Margaret Elroy came by later that week with her numbers. She arrived the way she always arrived, without announcement, with a no-nonsense directness that Ruth had come to appreciate more than she'd expected to when they first started talking. Margaret had been keeping records of her flock's production the way an accountant kept records of a business she expected to run forever. Careful columns of dates and numbers going back 3 years, written in a hand that was small and precise and left no room for ambiguity. Ruth spread the papers on the kitchen table and read them without speaking for a long time. "You see it," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "August," Ruth said. "Production drops here." She touched the page. "But the birds didn't start declining then. They started declining here." She moved her finger back 2 pages. "In June. The production numbers just didn't reflect it until August because there was enough carried momentum to mask it." Margaret looked at the page and then looked at Ruth. "How do you see that in the numbers?" "The variance narrows. Here, in May, the daily production numbers move around quite a bit. You're getting highs and lows. By June, the highs start disappearing. Everything compresses into the middle range and then below it. That's not seasonal. That's a behavioral change in the flock." Ruth tapped the June column. "Something happened in June." Margaret was quiet. She had the look of someone doing arithmetic. "We had a new dog in June," she said finally. "The old one died in spring. The new one was restless. He was quiet by July, but the first few weeks, he was disturbing them at night. I didn't think it was significant. It might not be the whole answer," Ruth said, "but disrupted sleep and laying hens reduces production, and if the disruption happens during a critical period, it can reset their pattern for months. The body doesn't know the dog stopped. It just knows it was unsafe for a while." She paused. "What are you feeding them?" Margaret told her. Ruth asked several more questions about water access, about coop temperature in summer, about whether the feed source had changed at any point. Margaret answered all of them with the same concise precision she brought to everything, and Ruth wrote the answers in the notebook. And by the time they had been talking for an hour, they had assembled something that looked less like a mystery and more like a diagram of a problem with identifiable parts. "I can tell you what I'd try," Ruth said. "I can't promise it will work." "Tell me anyway," Margaret said. Ruth told her. It wasn't complicated. A change in the timing of the evening feeding, some modifications to where the water was placed to encourage more consistent hydration throughout the day, a different arrangement of the roosting area that would give the birds more sense of security at night. Small things. The kind of things that looked, on paper, too small to matter. Margaret listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "These are the same principles you're applying to your own birds." "Yes." "Observation, individual attention, adjusting based on what you see rather than what the general rule says." "Essentially, yes." Margaret picked up her papers and squared them against the table into a neat stack. "My husband would have said it wasn't worth the time," she said, "that you just get more chickens if the ones you have aren't producing." "A lot of people would say that," Ruth said. "They're wrong," Margaret said flatly. She tucked the papers under her arm and stood up to go. At the door she paused, and for a moment her face opened slightly into something that was as close to warmth as Margaret Elroy seemed able to manage. "You're doing something real here, Ruth. Whether it ends up where you think it ends up or not, what you're doing is real. I want you to know I see that." She left before Ruth could formulate a response. Ruth stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her cross the yard to her horse and felt something in her chest that was less like pride and more like the sensation of being recognized by someone whose recognition meant something. She went back inside and wrote in the notebook. M. Elroy, pattern identified. Sleep disruption. June origin, compounding. Recommended adjustments provided. She sees it. She sees what the method is. It was the first time she had written about the method as if it was a thing with a name. The trouble arrived, as trouble often does in small communities, through the medium of someone trying to be helpful. Corinne Loff, Francis's daughter, the one who had circulated the story of the chicken purchase through Iron Hollow, with the enthusiasm of someone broadcasting important news, came to see Ruth on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of January. She was accompanied by her mother, which was unusual since Francis Loff generally preferred to communicate her opinions through other people rather than delivering them herself. Ruth was at the water barrel when they rode up. She watched them dismount with the careful attention she applied to anything that showed up unannounced, and went to meet them. "Mrs. Crow," Frances said. She was a stout woman in her mid-40s with a face that had settled into an expression of permanent gentle disapproval, the kind of face that made everything it looked at seem slightly wanting. "I hope we're not interrupting." "I was getting water," Ruth said. "It can wait. Come in." The kitchen was not warm. No room in that house was truly warm in January. But it was warmer than outside, and Ruth put the kettle on because it was what you did, and because having something to occupy her hands helped her think more clearly. Corinne sat down readily. Frances sat down with the air of someone doing something slightly beneath them. "We heard you've been talking to people about their animals," Frances said. "Margaret Elroy, and I believe the Hendersons were asking you something about their goats." "I've talked to a few people," Ruth said carefully. "If someone asks me what I think, I tell them what I think." "That's very generous," Frances said, in a tone that made generosity sound like a character flaw. "Mama just wants to understand what you're actually doing," Corinne said, shooting her mother a sideways look. "That's all. Because people are talking about it, and when people talk about things, they say all kinds of things, and Mama thought it was better to come ask you directly." "What are people saying?" Ruth asked, turning from the kettle. Frances made the face. "That you've got some kind of system. That those birds you bought from Harlan, the ones everyone thought were dying, that they're better now. More than better." "They are better," Ruth said. "That's accurate. People are also saying—" Frances paused, picking her words with the care of someone who wants to say something pointed while maintaining the appearance of just reporting facts. "That you've been spending an unusual amount of time alone in that barn, writing things down." "I keep records," Ruth said. "Every day?" "Every day." Frances looked at her hands. "I don't mean to be unkind," she said, which was what people always said immediately before being unkind. "But people wonder. When something doesn't follow the natural pattern of things, people wonder about the explanation." Ruth poured the hot water into 2 cups and set them on the table. She sat down across from Frances Loff and looked at her steadily. "What natural pattern am I violating?" "Sick birds die," Frances said. "That's the natural pattern." "Sometimes they do," Ruth said. "Sometimes they don't. If the reason they're sick can be addressed, and the address is consistent enough and long enough." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "I'm not doing anything that can't be explained, Mrs. Locke. I'm watching carefully, and I'm writing down what I see, and I'm adjusting what I do based on what the watching tells me. That's all it is." "Then why are the results so different from what anyone expected?" "Because most people don't do those things." She said it without heat, but without apology either. "Not because they can't. Because it takes more time than people think they have, and because nobody taught them to look at animals the way I'm looking at them." A silence fell. Corinne was watching her mother with an expression that was hard to read, some mixture of anxiety and something that might have been admiration, or the beginning of it. Frances picked up her cup. She turned it in her hands. "My husband's stock is not doing well this winter," she said, and her voice had changed slightly. Dropped the performance quality it had been carrying, landed on something that was just a woman saying a true and worrying thing. "He won't admit it, but I see the numbers. He's going to lose cattle if spring doesn't come early and come right." Ruth looked at her. "I'm not saying I believe everything works the way you say it does," Frances continued quickly, as if she needed to qualify before she could continue. I'm asking, if there's anything in what you're doing that might help with cattle." "I don't know," Ruth said honestly. "I've been working with chickens. Some of what I've learned probably applies to any livestock, but I haven't tested it on cattle, and I won't pretend I have." She paused. "Tell me what you're seeing with the herd. Tell me what's changed." Frances Loch, who had come here on the pretext of asking questions but was, Ruth understood now, actually looking for an answer she was afraid to ask for directly. Frances Loff began to talk. Corinne caught Ruth's eye across the table and gave her a small, grateful look, and Ruth nodded once and turned her attention back to Frances and the problem. It was Elias who noticed first that the quality of the eggs had changed. He was not generally a man who paid close attention to eggs. They were a food item, present when available, absent when not. Part of the background mechanics of daily life that he engaged with practically but didn't examine. But one morning in late January, he cracked an egg into the pan and stopped moving. "Ruth," he said. She came over. She looked at the pan. The yolk was a deep, almost orange yellow, not the pale yellow of the eggs they'd been buying from Harlan Putt when they could afford them. The white was firm, not watery. It held its shape in the pan in a way that somehow looked different from ordinary eggs, although she would have had a hard time articulating exactly why. "That came from our birds?" Elias said. "Came from the nest box this morning, yes." He cooked it and tasted it and was quiet for a moment. "That's different," he said. "Yes." "How different?" She thought about it. "Do you remember that summer we went to your aunt's place in Ohio, the summer before we came west?" "I remember the summer." She had hens that she'd been keeping for years, very carefully. She knew every bird by name. Ruth looked at the pan. "The eggs tasted like that." Elias looked at the pan too. Then he looked at her. "Ruth, if the eggs taste like this, I know. When you cook the birds themselves, I know, Elias. I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks." He sat back. He picked up his coffee, which was mostly hot water with a scraping of grounds because the actual coffee had run out in December. He drank it with the expression of a man performing the action of coffee drinking from memory. "So what do we do with that? I'm still working out how to prove it," she said. "Because I know what I think is happening, and I know what I'm tasting in these eggs. But knowing a thing and being able to demonstrate it to someone else are two different problems. And you need to demonstrate it. I need someone credible to taste it and say what they taste, out loud, where other people can hear them." Elias was quiet for a moment. "You're thinking about Dorothea Hark," he said. Ruth looked at him. Sometimes he understood the shape of what she was planning before she'd fully articulated it to herself, which was one of the things she valued most in him and occasionally found unnerving. "She's the most respected woman in Iron Hollow," Ruth said. "She's not kind to fools or to wishful thinking. If she says something is true, people believe it, and she doesn't say things she doesn't mean. She also told Mabel Stetson that your chicken purchase was the saddest thing she'd seen all fall," Elias said. "I know she did. And you want her opinion." "I want her honest assessment," Ruth said, "which is what she gives, whether you want it or not. That's exactly why she's the right person." She paused. "The question is what I ask her to assess, and I think it has to be the birds themselves, not just the eggs. Anyone can explain away an egg, but if she eats a meal prepared from these birds—" "You'd be sacrificing one of them," Elias said. "I know." He looked at her steadily. "Which one?" Ruth looked out the window toward the barn. She had not let herself think too specifically about this part yet. "Not Penny," she said, after a moment. Something shifted in Elias's face. Not quite amusement, but close to it, and soft. "Obviously not Penny," he said. "One of the others. The strongest." She turned back to him. "The point is to demonstrate what's possible when you do this right. If I sacrifice my weakest bird, the result won't show what I know these birds can be. It has to be the best." He was quiet. He looked at the egg pan again. Then he said, "This is the gamble." "Yes." "You lose the bird and the meal is ordinary. You've got nothing." "Yes." "And if it's not ordinary—" "Then everything changes," Ruth said, "or starts to." He nodded. He did the calculation she could see him doing. Not financial, not exactly practical, but something deeper. The kind of math that measures risk against what you've already lost and what you might still be able to build. She watched him arrive at the answer and saw it settle across his face. "Tell me when you're ready," he said. "I'll help you prepare." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. His hand was rough, scarred in 2 places from the war, and in a 3rd place from a fence wire incident 2 springs back that had been much worse than it looked at the time. She had memorized those hands. 2 weeks, she said. "I want 2 more weeks of observation, and then I'll go talk to Dorothea." He turned his hand over and held hers. 2 weeks, he said. Outside, the January wind moved across the claim, and in the barn the 9 birds were going about their particular lives, none of them knowing what Ruth had decided and what was riding on it. She hoped she was right. She was fairly certain she was right. The difference between those 2 things was everything. The 2 weeks passed the way difficult waiting always does. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a particular texture that made each day feel both too short and too long. Ruth spent them watching. That was the only word for it that felt accurate. She watched the birds the way she had watched them from the beginning, but with a sharpened attention now that came from knowing what she was watching for. She was building a case, even if she was the only one who knew it yet. Every entry in the notebook during those 2 weeks was a piece of evidence she was assembling against the day she would need to present it. What she saw continued to exceed her expectations, which was both satisfying and unsettling. The weight the birds had put on through January was not the soft, loose weight of animals that had been overfed and underexercised. It had a different quality, denser, more evenly distributed. She could feel it when she handled them. The leg injury bird, the one she'd worried about in December, had found its equilibrium so thoroughly that she sometimes forgot which one it was until she saw the slight tilt in its walk. The formerly underweight pair had become the most aggressive eaters in the flock, as if their bodies were making up for lost time with a ferocity that still surprised her every morning. And Penny remained Penny, watchful, steady, the quiet organizing principle around which the others arranged themselves without appearing to choose to. Elias left her to her watching without asking for updates, which was his way of respecting that she was working even when the work was invisible. He had his own work. The fence was done, finally, and he turned his attention to the root cellar repair that had been postponed since October. She could hear him out there most mornings when she was in the barn, the methodical sound of someone doing hard work with patience rather than hurry. On the 14th morning, she went into the barn and spent a long time looking at the bird she had been thinking about for a week. She had not named it. She had named none of them except Penny, and even that had been Elias's doing. But she had been watching this particular bird for a week with the specific attention of someone deciding something, and she had made her decision, and the morning had arrived. It was the second largest bird in the flock, a hen with feathers that had come back almost copper red after the mite damage, the kind of color that seemed too vivid for February. She had been among the worst of the respiratory cases in December, the wet-breathing, labored kind that Ruth had not been confident would resolve. And she had resolved, completely, and had come out of it with what Ruth could only describe as an excess of health, as if the recovery had overshot its target.
"You've done good," Ruth told the hen, which was a ridiculous thing to say, and she knew it. She did what needed to be done quickly and without ceremony, because ceremony would not have made it better and would have made it worse. Then she went inside to clean up and told Elias it was time to go talk to Dorothea Hark.
Dorothea lived half a mile from the settlement center in a house that was the most solid structure in Iron Hollow, not because she had more money than anyone else, though she might have, but because she had been the first to build and had built with the conviction of someone who intended to stay. The house had real wooden floors and a stone fireplace that drew properly and windows that sealed against the wind. Compared to the Crow homestead, it was a different world. Ruth drove the wagon alone. Elias had offered to come, and she had told him she needed to do this part herself. He had not argued. Dorothea answered the door before Ruth had finished knocking, which suggested she'd seen the wagon coming up the track. She looked at Ruth, and then at the cloth-covered bundle Ruth was carrying, and her expression moved through several things quickly before settling on a careful neutrality. "Ruth Crow," she said. "Mrs. Hark, I have something I want to ask you."
"Come in, then." The interior of Dorothea's house was warm, in the way of a place that had been properly heated for years, rather than desperately heated for one winter. There were things on the walls, a sampler, 2 framed photographs, a small mirror, and a rug on the floor, real signs of permanence that Ruth registered without quite meaning to compare them to her own kitchen.
Dorothea sat her down at the table without fuss and brought out 2 cups of actual coffee, real coffee, which Ruth accepted with the kind of gratitude she tried not to let show on her face. "I want to ask a favor," Ruth said. "I assumed that when you showed up with that bundle. What's in it?" "One of my birds, dressed and ready for cooking." Ruth set it on the table between them. "I want to cook it here, in your kitchen, and I want you to taste it and tell me honestly what you think." Dorothea looked at the bundle. She looked at Ruth. "Why my kitchen?" "Because you're the most honest person in Iron Hollow," Ruth said. "And because if you tell people something is true, they believe you. And because you told Mabel Stetson last fall that my buying those chickens was the saddest thing you'd seen all season, and I think you should see how the story ends." A short silence. Dorothea had the kind of face that gave very little away voluntarily, but something moved across it at that. Not quite amusement, not quite respect, some compound of both. "That's a frank reason," she said. "You seem like a woman who prefers frank reasons."
"I do," Dorothea said. She reached out and lifted the edge of the cloth and looked at the bird beneath it with the assessing eye of a woman who had been evaluating poultry for decades. She didn't say anything right away. She looked for a long time. "This came from the birds you bought in November?" "It did." "The dying ones?" "The ones everyone thought were dying, yes."
Dorothea set the cloth back. She picked up her coffee cup and held it. "My kitchen is yours," she said. "Let's see what you've got." The cooking took 2 hours. Ruth had brought her own herbs and the particular fat preparation she'd been using, but the cooking itself was straightforward. Nothing elaborate, nothing designed to disguise or enhance beyond the ingredients themselves. That was the point. If she buried what she was trying to demonstrate under technique and seasoning, the result would prove the technique and not the bird. Dorothea watched her work without offering to help, which was the right thing to do. This needed to be Ruth's hands and Ruth's process, so that what resulted was unambiguously Ruth's product. She asked a few questions while Ruth worked, about the feed adjustments, about the treatment timeline, about the notebook. Ruth answered all of them the same way she'd answered Margaret Elroy's questions, honestly, specifically, without oversimplifying. "You changed the feed composition over time," Dorothea said. "It wasn't quite a question. Several times, based on what I was observing. And you wrote all of it down. Every adjustment, every response, what worked and what didn't." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "My father kept livestock for 40 years, she said. He never wrote a single thing down." "Did he lose animals he didn't expect to lose?" A pause. "Yes, often. Most people do," Ruth said. "Not because they don't care, because they're keeping it all in their heads, and heads forget things. And when something goes wrong, they can't always identify which part of the normal went wrong because they're not sure what the normal was." Dorothea looked at her steadily. "And the writing fixes that." "The writing is how I know what I know," Ruth said. "Otherwise, I just have an impression. You can't build anything on an impression." She carved the bird at the table, and the kitchen filled with a smell that made Dorothea go very still, in a way that was not dramatic but was unmistakable. The particular stillness of a person whose attention has been fully captured without their permission. Ruth set the plate in front of her and sat down across the table and said nothing. Dorothea looked at the plate. Then she picked up her fork and took a bite, and chewed slowly with her eyes not quite focused on anything in the room, and chewed some more, and swallowed. Ruth waited. "That's not ordinary," Dorothea said. "No, the flavor is—" Dorothea stopped. She took another bite, more slowly this time, with the deliberate focus of someone trying to accurately identify what they were tasting. "I haven't tasted chicken like this since I was a girl. My grandmother kept birds. She was particular about it in a way nobody around here is particular about anything." She set down the fork and looked at Ruth directly. "What you're tasting is an animal that was healthy all the way through, not just on the outside. The meat shows it." "That's what I believe," Ruth said. "Believing it and doing it are different things." "I know." "You did it." "Yes." Another silence. Dorothea picked up the fork again and finished a substantial portion of the plate, and Ruth understood that this was its own form of verdict. "You didn't continue eating something while you were still deciding whether it was what you thought it was." Dorothea had decided. "How many birds do you have left?" Dorothea asked. 8 after this one." "And they're all like this?" "I believe they are. Some variation, but this quality, yes." "What do you need?" Dorothea said. Ruth looked at her. The directness of the question caught her slightly off balance. She had come prepared for more resistance, more skepticism, the kind of long argument that required gradual erosion. "I need people to know this is possible," Ruth said. "I need to show that what I've done with these birds is repeatable, that it's not luck or particular circumstances, that there's a method that can be learned and applied." "And then?" "And then there's a market for birds raised this way, and for eggs, and eventually maybe, for the knowledge of how to do it, people who want to produce better stock and need to understand the method." Dorothea set down her fork entirely. She folded her hands on the table the way a woman folds her hands when she's made a decision and is preparing to state it. "If I tell people what I tasted today and what I know about how you produced it, People will listen, she said. You understand that. That's why I came to you. It's not a small thing I'm offering. I know it isn't, Ruth said. And I'm not asking you to say more than what's true. I'm asking you to say what's true. Dorothea considered her. The fire in the stone fireplace shifted and sent a brief brightness across the table. What you're asking for is a chance, she said. Yes. Not a guarantee. I don't believe in guarantees, Ruth said. I believe in demonstrable evidence and enough time to act on it. Something happened in Dorothea Hark's face that Ruth had not seen there before. It was slow to arrive and quiet when it got there, but it was unmistakably something like approval. The real kind, not the social performance of it, but the actual private recognition of one capable person by another. I'll tell people what I ate today, Dorothea said, and what I know about how you produced it. That's all I'll do. I won't embellish and I won't advocate beyond what I know to be true. She paused. But when Dorothea Hark says something about food and livestock, in this settlement, people don't forget it. No, Ruth said, they don't. She drove home in this February cold with an empty cloth and a feeling that she could not name precisely. Not triumph, not relief, something more complicated than either. The gamble she had laid out to Elias 2 weeks ago had paid out exactly as she'd hoped it would, and yet she was aware, more clearly than she'd been before she made it, of how thin the margin had been. One bird, one meal, one woman's judgment. Any of those three things slightly different, and she would be driving home to 8 birds and no ground gained. She pulled up to the house, and Elias came out of the barn when he heard the wagon, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at her face, the way he always did when she came back from something important, reading it the way she imagined he had once read terrain, for information rather than reassurance. Well, he said. She ate most of it, Ruth said. He absorbed this. And? She's going to tell people. He let out a breath that was not quite a sigh, something more controlled than a sigh, something that had been held for a while. He came around to the side of the wagon and helped her down, and she let him, which she didn't always because her legs were tired from the drive and the tension of the afternoon. What happens now? He said. Now we wait a few days, Ruth said. And then the settlement comes to us. She said it with a certainty she almost entirely felt. She said it because she needed to believe it was true, and because she had done everything she could think of to make it true. And because there was nothing left to do now but stand on the ground she'd built and see if it held. It was 3 days before anything happened. 3 days that had the peculiar suspended quality of time just before a change, when you know something is coming and can't yet see what shape it's going to take. On the morning of this 4th day, Mabel Stetson's eldest daughter showed up at the gate on a horse that she'd ridden hard for reasons she didn't explain, and asked Ruth if she had eggs to sell. Ruth did. By noon of the same day, 2 more families had sent word. By the following morning, Harlan Putt himself came by, which was notable because Harlan Putt very rarely left the trading post during business hours, and asked if they might discuss terms for stocking eggs on a regular basis. Ruth sat him down at the kitchen table. She made coffee with the last of the actual coffee grounds she'd been saving for a significant occasion, and she opened the notebook to a clean page, and she looked at Harlan Putt across the table with the expression of a woman who understood exactly what she was negotiating from and what she was negotiating toward. Let's discuss terms, she said. What Harlan said next surprised her. He had brought a figure in his head. She could tell he had prepared it because he produced it with the slightly over-casual delivery of someone who had rehearsed, and the figure he offered was almost twice what she had expected. She didn't let anything show on her face. That's for the eggs, he said. Dorothea Hark talked to me yesterday. Said the birds themselves were something different. If you're ever selling the birds— Not yet, Ruth said. Not yet, he repeated. All right, eggs for now. And when you are selling birds, you'll come to me first? I'll talk to you, she said, which was not the same commitment, and they both knew it. Harlan picked up his coffee. He looked at the notebook, at the dense columns of Ruth's careful handwriting covering the open page. What is all that? He said. Records. Of what? Of everything I've done and what resulted from it, Ruth said. Every adjustment, every observation, a complete account. He looked at it for another moment. Then he looked at her. You know what that is, don't you? He said, and something in his voice had shifted into a register she hadn't heard from Harlan Putt before. a seriousness that sat underneath his usual trader's neutrality. That's not just a notebook. That's the thing itself. That's how you'd do it again. Yes, Ruth said. That's exactly what it is. He nodded slowly. He set down his coffee and reached across the table with one hand, not quite touching the notebook, fingers stopping an inch from the cover. You planning to teach people what you know? Ruth looked at the notebook. She looked at Harlan. She thought about Margaret Elroy's production records spread on this same table. She thought about Frances Loft's voice dropping into honesty when she'd talked about the cattle her husband wouldn't admit were failing. She thought about what Dorothea had said, what you're asking for is a chance, and the particular weight of having earned the chance and now standing at the edge of what to do with it. I'm planning to understand it better first, she said. And then yes, I think so. Yes. Harlan sat back. He picked up his coffee again and finished it. He set the cup down and was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who is deciding whether to say the next thing or leave it unsaid. He said it. Ruth Crow, he said, last November when you bought those chickens off my lot, I felt bad about it for about a week. Thought I'd taken advantage of a woman in a hard spot. Sold her dying birds for money she couldn't spare. He paused. I don't think I need to feel bad about it anymore. It took her a moment to understand what he meant, and when she did, it arrived with a small, complicated warmth. Not quite forgiveness, not quite vindication, something older and stranger than either. No, she said. Don't think you do. He left, and she sat alone at the table for a few minutes after his wagon had gone. With the notebook in front of her and the coffee cups drained and the February light coming through the small kitchen window at the particular low angle it had in the afternoon, making everything in the room look sharp-edged and real. Then Elias came in from outside, stomping mud off his boots at the door, and looked at her. Harlan Putt, she said. He wants eggs, regular supply, and first consideration when we're ready to sell birds. Elias stood in the doorway for a moment. What did you tell him? I told him we'd discuss it when we're ready. She looked at him. We're going to need more birds. He nodded once, the way he nodded when a thing had moved from question to fact and required a different kind of attention. He came into the kitchen and sat down across from her and looked at the notebook and then at her face with the directness he'd always had. The quality of a man who looked at things straight because looking away had never served him. How many more? He said. Enough to do this right, Ruth said. Enough to prove it wasn't these particular birds. Enough to prove it's the method. He was quiet, running the numbers in the way he did, the practical arithmetic of feed and space and time and money, the real mathematics of a homestead life. We'd need to build another structure, he said. Proper one, not the barn. I know. That takes money we don't have. We will have it, she said, after a few weeks of eggs through Harlan's. And if the demand holds. It will hold, she said. Dorothea Hark told people what she tasted. In Iron Hollow, that doesn't unhappen. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him doing what he always did when she was ahead of him in certainty. Not catching up to her exactly, but deciding whether to trust the ground she was standing on. He had made that decision before. Enough times that the decision itself had a history between them, a track record she could point to even if she'd never said it aloud. All right, he said. Draw me what you want the structure to look like. I'll figure out how to build it. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand once, quickly, and then pulled the notebook toward her and opened it to a clean page and started drawing. Outside, the February wind had dropped to something almost gentle, and in the barn Penny was probably doing whatever Penny did in the late afternoons, which Ruth had never been entirely able to determine, but which clearly worked for her. 8 birds left, a notebook full of knowledge, a market that was just beginning to understand it was hungry for something it hadn't known existed. Ruth drew, and the lines on the page became a plan, and the plan became what happened next. The drawing became a structure, and the structure became real in the way that things become real on the frontier, not all at once, not cleanly, but through accumulated effort that left marks on the people doing it. Elias built the new enclosure through the last 2 weeks of February and the first week of March, working in whatever weather showed up because the weather was not going to wait for his convenience. Ruth helped when she could, which was less than she wanted. The egg production from the 8 remaining birds had created a demand that required her attention every morning and most afternoons. Preparing orders,
delivering to Harlan Putts twice a week, managing the small but real accounting that came with having actual income for the first time in longer than she wanted to calculate.
The money coming in was not large, but it was consistent, and consistency was something they had not had. And the difference between inconsistent and consistent was not a matter of degree but of kind. You could plan around consistent. You could build something around consistent. Elias finished the structure on a Thursday afternoon and came into the kitchen with the look of someone who had used up most of what they had on a task and was running on the last reserve. He sat down heavily at the table, and Ruth put a plate in front of him without being asked. Actual food, a real meal, because the egg income had made actual food possible again. And he ate without talking for several minutes. "It'll hold," he said finally. "Better drainage than the barn. Better light. I put the roost placement where you marked it on the drawing." "Thank you," Ruth said. "Don't thank me. Just make sure what you put in it does what you think it's going to do. It will." He looked at her across the table. He had the kind of exhausted face that paradoxically reveals more than a rested face does. The bones of it more visible, the expression stripped of anything performative. "How many birds are you thinking?" 12 to start," she said. "But not from Harlan this time. I need them from a different source. Cleaner stock to begin with, so I'm not spending weeks on recovery before I can start the real work." "Where from?" "Henderson, over on the Flat Creek claim. He's got Rhode Island Reds that he's been breeding carefully for 3 years. They're healthy birds. The problem is he's been selling eggs and not much else, so he hasn't gotten to see what they could be." She paused. "I've already talked to him." Elias set down his fork. "When did you talk to Henderson?" 2 weeks ago, when I was delivering to Putts." He looked at her with the expression that was somewhere between amusement and mild exasperation, the look he wore when he discovered she had been 3 steps ahead of a conversation he thought they were still in the early stages of. "So while I've been building the new structure, I've been working out where to fill it," she said. "Yes. You could have mentioned. I didn't want to complicate things while you were focused on the building." He picked his fork back up. "What are Henderson's terms?" "Fair," she said. "He wants eggs, not money. Eggs. From whatever birds we produce using his stock." She had the notebook open on the table beside her, and she turned it to show him the page where she'd written out the arrangement in her careful columns. 4 dozen eggs per month for 6 months. After that, we discuss whether he wants to extend the arrangement or take a percentage of any birds we sell." Elias read the page. He had the focused stillness he brought to numbers, reading through twice before looking up. "That's reasonable," he said. "Better than reasonable." He's a practical man. He understood the proposal. "How much did you tell him about the method?" "Enough to establish that I knew what I was doing, not enough to teach him what he hasn't asked to learn." Ruth looked at the page. "Not yet, anyway." Elias looked at her steadily. "You're protecting it." "I'm not protecting it like a secret," she said carefully. "I'm not going to lie to anyone about what I'm doing or how. But there's a difference between sharing knowledge and giving away the thing you built before you've established what it's worth." She paused. "When I understand the full value of what I've got, then I'll know what to share and what to build on." He nodded slowly. It was the nod of a man who trusted her judgment even when the specific logic wasn't entirely visible to him yet, which was its own kind of faith. The practical, daily kind that didn't require articulation. "When do we get the birds?" he said. "Saturday," she said, "if the weather holds." The weather held, barely. Saturday was the kind of late winter day that couldn't make up its mind. Cold in the morning, a brief warmth around noon that felt like a rumor of spring, then a hard return to cold by afternoon. Ruth and Elias made the trip to Henderson's claim together, which was only the second time they'd traveled anywhere together since December. And the company felt different from the usual solitude of their daily routines. Looser, a little. Ben Henderson was a quiet man in his late 40s who communicated primarily through action and tended to use words as a last resort. He had the birds ready in 2 crates when they arrived, each one selected with a visible care that told Ruth he'd thought seriously about which animals to let go. He handed over the crates and stood back and watched Ruth look through the slats at the birds with the particular attention she brought to everything. "The gray one in the second crate," she said. "How long has she been the heavy one?" Henderson looked mildly surprised. "Born that way?" he said. "Eats more than any 3 of the others. Always has." "Is she a good layer?" "Best I've got."
I'll keep that in mind. Ruth straightened up and looked at him directly. I'll take good care of them. I know you will, Henderson said. He said it without ceremony, just as a fact, and she understood that he had done his research before agreeing to this arrangement, had asked around, had heard from Margaret Elroy, or Dorothea Hark, or both what Ruth Mercer Crowe did with animals that came into her care. His willingness to part with 12 of his best birds was itself a form of endorsement, and she received it as such. On the drive home, the 2 crates of birds in the wagon bed behind them, Elias said, "Henderson was watching you look at those birds." I noticed. He had an expression on his face. What kind of expression? Elias thought about it, like a man who just understood something he'd been halfway understanding for a while. He glanced at her. Like maybe he'd been doing things one way for a long time, and suddenly he could see there was another way. Ruth looked at the road ahead. "That's the thing about this," she said. "Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The attention, the observation, the records. Once you understand why it works, ordinary methods start to look different. Incomplete. Is that good or bad?" "It's complicated," she said, "because it means more work. But the work pays out differently." He was quiet for a moment, watching the horses. "What happens if someone takes your method and uses it without you? Builds the same thing somewhere else, and you don't get any of it?" She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it, in fact, since the conversation with Harlan Putt about the notebook. "Then more animals live better lives and more families eat better food," she said, "which isn't the worst outcome." "Ruth, I know," she said, "the practical answer. The practical answer is that the notebook exists, and the notebook is mine, and what I know goes beyond what anyone could observe from the outside." She looked at her hands on the reins. "What I have isn't a recipe, it's a way of seeing. You can take the recipe, but you can't take the way of seeing. That has to be learned, and the learning takes time, and time with me has a value I haven't finished establishing yet." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the road and made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was somewhere in that family. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. Sometimes I forget who I married." "Who did you marry?" He thought about it seriously. "Someone who bought 11 dying chickens for 12 cents and turned it into a livestock operation," he said. "Someone who was always going to do something like that. I just didn't know what it was going to be yet." She didn't respond to that, but something in her chest settled into a warmth that the February cold couldn't reach. The 12 new birds went into the new structure on Saturday afternoon, and Ruth began the observation process the following morning. It was different this time from the beginning. The Henderson birds were not sick. They were healthy, well-fed, physically sound animals with no recovery work required. What Ruth was doing now was not rescue, but refinement, which required a different kind of attention, less the urgent watching of someone managing a crisis, and more the patient systematic watching of someone mapping terrain. She started a new section in the notebook. Fresh pages, fresh columns. She was more precise this time because she understood better what to measure and why. She tracked each bird against the others in ways she hadn't fully understood the first time through. Not just weight and eating, but the social relationships between them, the way the hierarchy formed and shifted, which birds were influencing which. She introduced feed variations on a deliberate schedule and noted the responses with a specificity that would have looked, to anyone glancing over her shoulder, like the work of someone who had been doing this for years. In a sense, she had been, just not with chickens she could choose. Penny remained in the original barn, separate from the new flock. Ruth had considered integrating her but decided against it. Penny was, at this point, a data point in herself, a living record of what was possible. Besides, Penny had opinions about her living situation and had never shown any particular desire for more company than the 7 remaining original birds provided. Through the rest of February and into March, 2 things happened simultaneously that pulled against each other in ways Ruth had to actively manage. The first was that word about the eggs had spread far enough and fast enough that the demand was beginning to outpace what 8 birds could produce, even 8 birds producing at the rate hers were. She had a waiting list, an actual waiting list, written in the back pages of the notebook, which was a problem of the best kind but still a problem, because unfilled demand was also disappointed expectation. And disappointed expectation had a way of curdling into skepticism. The second thing was that people had started coming to the property, not in large numbers and not announced. This was Iron Hollow, not a city,
and people retained their frontier directness about showing up without warning and expecting to be accommodated. But Margaret Elroy came back twice, with her own notebook this time, asking follow-up questions about the production adjustments Ruth had suggested for her laying hens. Ben Henderson rode by on a Wednesday to ask what Ruth thought about his water arrangement. A woman named Abigail Trout, who had a claim 15 miles north and whom Ruth had met exactly once at a settlement meeting 18 months prior, showed up on a Tuesday with a problem with her geese that had been going on for 6 weeks and that 2 different people had looked at without helping. Ruth looked at it. She figured it out. It took her about 40 minutes of observation and 2 pages of notes. Abigail Trout stood in the yard afterward with an expression that Ruth recognized. She'd seen it on Margaret's face and on Ben Henderson's on Saturday, and in a different, more guarded form on Frances Loff's face in her own kitchen. It was the expression of someone reassembling their understanding of something they'd thought they understood. "You figured that out in 40 minutes, Abigail said. "I've had a man from Dalton Creek look at those birds twice. He couldn't tell me anything useful." "He was probably looking for a single cause," Ruth said. "These things usually aren't one cause. They're a collection of small things that accumulate until they look like a big thing." "And you can see all of them at once?" "I can see what the evidence shows. I've learned to read the evidence." Ruth closed the notebook. "The writing helps. It forces you to be specific about what you're actually seeing rather than what you expect to see." Abigail was quiet. She was a rangy woman, probably Ruth's age, with hands that showed the same kind of work history that Ruth's did. "I'd like to learn that," she said, "the way you do it. I've got 30 geese and 12 laying hens and a small herd of goats, and every year I lose animals that maybe I didn't have to lose, and I never know exactly why." Ruth looked at her. She thought of the new pages in the notebook, still mostly empty. She thought of what she'd said to Harlan Putt about teaching, the tentative yes she'd given when he'd asked. "Come back next Tuesday," she said. "Bring your own records if you have any. If you don't, we'll start from where you are." Abigail nodded. She mounted her horse and was halfway down the track before she turned and called back, "What do you charge?" Ruth thought about it for a moment. "Eggs," she said, "or whatever you've got." Elias, who had been near the fence within earshot, waited until Abigail was out of range before he walked over. He had the look he sometimes had when things were moving faster than the pace he'd mentally planned for. Not alarmed, just recalibrating. "You're teaching now," he said. "I'm considering it." "You told her to come Tuesday." "I'm more than considering it." He looked at the track where Abigail's horse had disappeared. "How many people can you teach while still running what we've got here?" It was the right question. Ruth had been working up to it in her own head for 2 weeks without fully facing it yet, because fully facing it required deciding something she wasn't certain about. "Not as many as are going to ask," she said. "So we need to think about structure, about how this becomes something more organized." "Like what?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Let me think about it." He accepted this. He turned back toward the fence and then stopped. "The Henderson birds," he said. "How are they doing?" "Well," she said. And then, because it was Elias and she didn't perform for Elias, "Better than I expected even, and I expected well." She paused. "I think the method works on animals that aren't already sick. I think it might work even better, because I'm not spending weeks undoing damage. I'm just building." He turned back fully and looked at her. The afternoon light was the March kind now, not quite winter and not quite spring, and it made the yard look like something caught between 2 things, which was, Ruth thought, exactly what they were. "Is this going where I think it's going?" he said. "Where do you think it's going?" He looked at the new structure. The barn with its 8 original birds, the house, the fence he'd just finished, the account in the back of the notebook that had been slowly, steadily accumulating numbers that pointed in one direction. "I think we're building something," he said. "Not just surviving." "Yes," she said. "That's where it's going." The complication arrived, as complications usually did, from the direction she'd been watching least. It was Corinne Locke who brought the information, which was both fitting and mildly ironic given that Corinne had been one of the original circulators of the story of Ruth's chicken purchase. She appeared at the gate on a Thursday morning in the second week of March, looking flushed in a way that was more anxiety than cold. And when Ruth came out to meet her, she got down off her horse with the urgency of someone carrying something that needed to be set down.
"I thought you should know," she said without preamble. "Know what?" Ruth said. "There's a man. He's been in town since Monday. Name of Garfield Stroud, he says. He's from back east somewhere, some livestock operation." Corinne's words were coming out slightly faster than her usual pace. "He's been asking questions. About you specifically. About what you're doing here. About the birds and the eggs and the notebook." Ruth was still. "Who has he been talking to?" "Harlan Putt, mostly. And he bought Dorothy a Hart coffee at the meeting hall yesterday." Corinne hesitated. "He told Harlan that he represents a livestock concern that's interested in methods that improve production, that he's been hearing about what you've developed and that he's come to—" the word he used was evaluate. "Evaluate," Ruth repeated. "He wants to meet with you," Corinne said. "He asked Harlan to arrange it." She looked at Ruth with an expression that was more clear-eyed than Ruth had previously given her credit for. "I don't know if he's what he says he is, but I know that when men come from back east to evaluate things on the frontier, it usually means they want to take something home with them." Ruth stood in the yard for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. "When did Harlan say he'd arranged this meeting?" she said. "He was going to send word today, I think." Ruth nodded. She looked at Corinne, this girl who had gossiped about her last fall, who had carried the story of the dying chickens through Iron Hollow like entertainment, and who had shown up this morning at her gate out of something that looked, actually, like genuine consideration. "Thank you," Ruth said, "for coming to tell me." Corinne shrugged, but the shrug was self-conscious in a way that suggested she knew why she'd come and was not entirely sure how to carry that knowledge. "You helped my mother," she said. "With the cattle thing. She won't admit how much, but I can see it." She gathered her reins. "Just be careful, that's all." She rode out, and Ruth stood in the yard until the sound of the horse faded, and then she turned and went inside to find the notebook and sit with what she'd just learned. Harlan's message arrived 2 hours later, carried by his youngest boy on a pony. A man named Garfield Stroud, representing the Consolidated Livestock Improvement Society of St. Louis, wished to call on Mrs. Ruth Crow at her convenience to discuss matters of mutual interest. Ruth read the note twice. She set it on the table beside the notebook. She looked at both objects for a long moment. The written record of everything she'd built beside the written inquiry of someone who'd heard about it and come to see. Elias came in from outside and read the note over her shoulder and was quiet. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to meet him," she said. "That's what I thought, but I want to understand what he's actually offering before I decide anything," she said. "And I want to understand what he thinks he's getting. Those might be different things." "They almost certainly are," Ruth said. "That's the whole point." She looked at the notebook. She thought about Corinne's words. When men come from back east to evaluate things, it usually means they want to take something home. She thought about what she had in the notebook and what she had in her head and the distinction between them that she'd explained to Elias on the ride home from Henderson's. "You can take the recipe," she had said, "but you can't take the way of seeing." She picked up a pen and turned to a fresh page in the notebook and began making notes. Not about the birds, about Garfield Stroud, and what she knew, and what she needed to find out, and what she was and was not willing to do. If he had come to take something, she intended to make sure he understood the full cost of the thing he thought he was taking. And if he had come for something else, something more like a partnership, more like the kind of arrangement that might expand what she was building rather than extract it, then she needed to know that too, and know it clearly, before she decided what it was worth to her. Elias sat down across from her and waited while she wrote, the way he always waited, without impatience, without filling the silence with words that didn't need to be there. Outside, March was doing its uncertain thing with the weather, half cold and half something that might eventually become spring. In the new structure, 12 Henderson birds were eating the morning feed. In the barn, 8 original birds were going about their day, with Penny at the center of things as she always was. And in the kitchen of a homestead that was no longer simply surviving, Ruth Mercer Crow sat with her notebook and prepared for the next conversation, the same way she had prepared for every difficult thing since November. By thinking it through completely, by writing down what she knew, and by deciding in advance what she would and would not give away. Garfield Stroud arrived on a Friday morning, which Ruth suspected was deliberate. A Friday gave him the weekend to stay in the settlement if the first conversation went well, or a reason to leave quickly if it didn't.
He was not what she had expected, which she recognized immediately as a mistake on her part. She had built a picture of him from Corinne's words. Back east, livestock concern, evaluate. And the picture had assembled itself into someone older, more formal, the kind of representative that large commercial operations sent to the frontier when they wanted to make clear they were doing you a favor by showing up. She had prepared for condescension. Garfield Stroud was perhaps 35, lean in the way of someone who traveled constantly and ate irregularly, with a quality of attention in his face that she recognized because she saw it in the mirror. The look of a person who was always watching, always filing things away. He arrived in a rented wagon from Putt's livery, which told her he hadn't been certain of the road conditions, and he got down from it with the mild awkwardness of someone more accustomed to trains than wagon seats. He looked at the property as he walked toward the house, the new structure, the barn, the fence line, the yard where a few birds were visible. He looked at it the way she had taught herself to look at things, not to judge, but to read. She met him at the gate. "Mrs. Crow," he said. He had a direct handshake, which she noted. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me." "I haven't agreed to anything beyond a conversation," she said. "Come in." She put him at the kitchen table, which was where she put everyone, because the kitchen table was where things got decided in this house, and she saw no reason to change the location simply because the person across from it wore a better coat than most. She did not make coffee. She wanted him slightly off balance, slightly aware that the hospitality was provisional. He seemed to understand this, which raised her estimation of him slightly. "I'll tell you why I'm here without making you ask for it," he said, settling into the chair. He had a leather satchel that he put on the floor beside him, but didn't open. The Consolidated Livestock Improvement Society is exactly what it sounds like. A group of agricultural investors and practitioners in the Missouri and Illinois corridor who are interested in methods that improve the quality and productivity of livestock. We've been operating for about 6 years. We're not a government body, and we're not a charity. We're a commercial organization that profits when the methods we adopt and distribute prove effective. "How did you hear about me?" Ruth said. "Harlan Putt has a cousin in Dalton Creek," Stroud said. His cousin mentioned the eggs. "The eggs got to someone I know in the regional trading network. The someone told me there was a woman in Iron Hollow who was producing livestock results that didn't match what anyone expected from the conditions." He paused. "I followed up on 3 similar reports in the last 2 years. The other 2 turned out to be overstatement. I came to see if this one was." "And?" He looked at her steadily. "I walked past your barn on the way from the gate. The birds I could see through the slats of the new structure are visibly different from ordinary farm stock. Not slightly different, noticeably." He paused. "That's a preliminary observation from a distance of 8 feet. But I've been looking at poultry operations for 6 years, and I know what I'm looking at." Ruth had the notebook on the table in front of her closed. She put her hand on it without opening it. "What does the society want?" "That depends on what you have," Stroud said. "If what you have is a method, a reproducible, teachable method that produces these results consistently, then we're interested in a formal arrangement. Documentation, distribution rights, potentially a consulting arrangement where you work with the society's network of farms to implement it." "And what does the society offer in exchange?" "Capital," he said simply. "Money to expand what you're doing here. Access to a network of farms across 4 states that can implement and verify the method at scale, and a percentage of whatever commercial value the society derives from the method going forward." Ruth looked at him. She looked at the satchel on the floor. "What percentage?" "That's negotiable," he said, "depending on what the documentation shows and what the method demonstrably produces." "Everything is negotiable," she said. "That's not an answer." He almost smiled. 60-40 in the society's favor, he said. "On commercial licensing, you'd retain full ownership of the method itself and the right to practice it independently." Ruth was quiet for a moment. She did the math, not because she needed to. She'd been doing it in her head since Corinne's warning, but because she wanted him to see her doing it, wanted him to understand that she was not impressed by numbers delivered quickly, and she was not going to respond to them quickly. "Tell me about the other 2, she said. He blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The 2 similar reports that turned out to be overstatement. What went wrong with them? What did you find when you got there?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read, and then he sat back and told her. He was honest about it.
more honest than she'd expected, which again adjusted her reading of him upward. One had been a genuine method, but applied by a man who couldn't explain it because he'd never documented it, couldn't repeat it reliably, and had no way of teaching it to anyone else. The other had been straightforward fabrication, a farmer who had bought healthy stock and presented them as a transformation.
The first one is the common failure, Stroud said. People develop good instincts through experience, and then they can't separate the instinct from the method because they never wrote it down. The instinct works for them and fails for everyone else because no one else has their 20 years. Ruth looked at the notebook. "Open it," she said. He looked at the notebook. "May I?" "That's why I told you to open it." He reached across the table and opened the notebook to the first page. He read without speaking. She watched his face as he read, which told her more than his words would have. The quality of his attention sharpened within the first 30 seconds, and she saw the moment he understood what he was looking at. A slight shift in his posture, a stillness that settled over him. He turned pages. He read for a long time. She let him. When he looked up, something had changed in his expression. Not dramatically. He was a man who kept his face controlled, as she kept hers, but the performance of professional evaluation had dropped back to something that was closer to plain response. "This is complete," he said. "Yes." Not just observations. Analysis. Method changes with causation documented. You recorded not just what you did, but why you did it, and what you expected. If you can't explain the reasoning, you can't teach it, Ruth said. And if you can't teach it, you have nothing worth sharing. He turned to the section she'd started for the Henderson birds, the new pages. He read those too. "You started with sick animals," he said, "and now you're applying the same principles to healthy stock from the beginning. The method works better without the recovery time. I had to start where I started. I'm not starting there anymore." He closed the notebook carefully. He put his hands flat on the table. "What do you want?" he said. "Not what will you take. What do you want?" She registered the distinction. "I want to expand what I'm doing here," she said. "Not just eggs and birds. A proper operation, teaching as well as production. I want the people in this settlement and the ones around it to have access to this method whether or not they can pay much for it, because the women and men out here need this kind of knowledge more than anyone in your society's Missouri corridor does." He nodded slowly. "And commercially?" "Commercially, I want a fair percentage that reflects the fact that without the method there's nothing to license." She paused. 60-40 is not a fair percentage." "What is?" 50-50 on licensing," she said, "with a guaranteed annual payment to us regardless of what the society licenses, so that if your distribution produces less than you're projecting, we're not the ones who absorb the loss." He was quiet. He picked up the satchel from the floor and set it on the table and opened it, and she saw that it contained papers, actual documents, prepared ones, which told her he had come with terms ready and had been curious to see how close her demands would land to them. He looked at the papers and then at her. 50-50 is higher than our standard arrangement. Your standard arrangement is with people who didn't document their method, Ruth said, and didn't build a waiting list for their eggs before they came looking for capital, and didn't already have relationships with 6 farms in the surrounding area who are implementing variations of this method because the woman who developed it spent the winter teaching them. A pause. 6 farms. 7, as of Tuesday, she said. Abigail trout, geese primarily, but the principles transfer. Garfield Stroud looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the notebook. Then he looked back at her. 50-50, he said. With the annual guarantee. I'll need to get confirmation from the Society's board, but I'm authorized to make a preliminary agreement today if the terms are reasonable. These are reasonable. Ruth put her hand out across the table. He shook it. They spent the next 2 hours going through the notebook together, Stroud asking questions, and Ruth answering them with the specificity that came from having lived every page of it. He was a good questioner, precise, practical, genuinely curious in a way that wasn't theater. She found herself revising her initial wariness not into trust exactly, but into a professional respect that felt like solid ground to stand on. At one point he asked about the alert bird, the one she'd pointed out on the first day, the one Elias had named Penny. "She's still here," Ruth said. "Can I see her?" She took him to the barn. Penny was where Penny usually was in the late morning, occupying a particular corner of the pen with the composure of something that had long since decided it was permanent. She looked at Garfield Stroud with the clear-eyed steadiness she brought to everything, and he looked back at her.
"She's the one who organized the others," Ruth said. "From the beginning. Before any of them were well enough to have social behaviors, she was the one they oriented toward." "You documented that?" "In detail. It's in the notebook." He watched Penny for a moment. "She's remarkable," he said. "She is," Ruth agreed. "She's also a chicken. I try to remember both things." He laughed at that. A real laugh, short and genuine, and she thought that whatever happened with the society and the arrangement and all the rest of it, this was probably a man she could work with. She left him to make his notes in the yard and went inside to find Elias. He was in the kitchen, pretending to sharpen a knife that was already sharp, which was what he did when he was waiting for information and didn't want to appear to be waiting for information. "Well," he said. 50-50, she said. "Licensing on the method. Annual guarantee regardless of their distribution outcomes. He's presenting it to the board, but he said he's authorized to commit preliminarily." Elias set down the knife. He looked at her with an expression she had seen before, the one that lived between relief and something larger than relief, something that didn't have a clean name. Ruth, that's real money." Eventually. "It's real money, and it's reach," she said. "Farms in Missouri and Illinois. The method going somewhere, it couldn't go on my own." She sat down at the table. "And we keep the operation here. We keep the teaching. None of that goes to them." He sat down too. The kitchen was quiet except for the wind outside, which had developed a warmth in it over the last few days. The first genuine warmth of the year, the kind that meant something rather than lying about it. "What did you think of him?" Elias said. "Honest," she said. "Or honest enough, which is about all you can ask from a business arrangement." She paused. He read the notebook carefully. He understood what he was looking at. That matters. It means he'll represent it accurately to the board instead of simplifying it into something it isn't. And if the board doesn't confirm, then we do it ourselves for longer, and we get there anyway, she said. "But I think they'll confirm." He nodded. He looked at his hands on the table, those scarred, work-marked hands that she had always thought of as one of the most honest things about him, hands that showed exactly what they'd done. "I want to say something," he said. "Say it." "This started because we had 12 cents and you spent it on dying birds," he said. "And I stood out there at that fence and I didn't say it, but I thought, this is the last bad decision. We can't survive another one." He looked up at her. "I was wrong about which thing it was." She looked at him steadily. "You helped me build the shelter," she said. "The first night. You didn't argue about it." I asked what the plan was. "That's not the same as arguing," she said. "That's the same as believing there was a plan worth asking about." She paused. "That mattered. That mattered more than you think." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the knife he'd been pretending to sharpen and actually put it away, which was its own kind of statement. Stroud left that afternoon with a copy of the notebook's table of contents. Not the notebook itself, which Ruth retained, but a precise summary she wrote out for him in an hour while he waited. A document that laid out the method's structure in enough detail to present to the board without giving away the full body of knowledge it would take months to truly transfer. She walked him to the wagon. He climbed up with slightly less awkwardness than he'd climbed down, which she thought was probably as much improvement as one day in the frontier could produce in a man accustomed to trained seats. "I'll send word within 2 weeks," he said. "The board meets on the last Thursday of the month." "I'll be here," she said. He looked at the property one more time. The barn, the new structure, the fence, the house with its slightly crooked shutter that Elias had never quite gotten around to fixing. He looked at it the way she had noticed he looked at things, reading them. "Mrs. Crow," he said, "what you've built here, I want you to understand that what you did is not common. Not the method. The method is remarkable, but methods can be found. What's not common is the documentation, the teaching, the fact that you didn't stop at your own fence line." He paused. "Most people, when they figure something out, they use it for themselves. You used it, and then you tried to give it away." "I didn't give it away," she said. "I shared it. There's a difference." He considered this. "Yes," he said. "I suppose there is." He drove out,
and she stood at the gate until the wagon was gone from sight. And then she stood there a little longer, not really looking at anything, just standing in the early March air that finally, had something in it besides cold. Spring came the way it always came to Iron Hollow, which was to say imperfectly and on its own schedule, with no regard for what anyone needed it to do. There were 3 more cold snaps after the warmth of early March, one of them hard enough to concern her about the new structure, and a week of rain that turned the yard into a problem and the road into a worse one. But it came. The board of the Consolidated Livestock Improvement Society sent their confirmation letter on the 28th of March, 11 days after Stroud's visit. Ruth read it twice at the kitchen table and then folded it and put it under the notebook and finished her morning coffee before she went to find Elias. He was out at the new structure, checking the drainage he'd installed, which had held through the rain week better than either of them had expected. "It's confirmed," she said. He turned. He had mud on his boots up to the ankle and a look on his face that was doing its best to stay practical and not quite succeeding. "The terms you discussed?" "Exactly the terms," she said. "And a clause I didn't expect. They want to publish a summary of the method in their quarterly bulletin. With attribution. With your name on it." "With my name on it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the morning light. Then he looked at the new structure, the birds visible through the slats moving around in their morning business. He looked at the barn where the original 8 were going about their lives in the parallel universe they'd been occupying since November. "Ruth Mercer Crow," he said, credited in a livestock bulletin. "Don't make it bigger than it is," she said, but she was aware that she was smiling in a way she couldn't entirely control. "I'm making it exactly as big as it is," he said. He was smiling too, in the careful way he smiled when something had moved him, and he wasn't going to say so directly, but wasn't going to pretend he hadn't been moved either. The weeks that followed were the busiest of Ruth's life, which was a significant statement given what the previous 6 months had been. The agreement with the society required a formal version of the method documentation, not just the notebook, but a structured written account that someone with no prior knowledge could read and begin to understand. Ruth worked on this in the evenings after everything else was done, at the kitchen table by lamplight, with the notebook open beside her as reference and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow because she kept forgetting it existed. It was harder than she expected, not because the knowledge was unclear in her head, but because translating embodied knowledge into written instruction required a kind of precision that she hadn't had to apply before. When she was in the barn, she knew things she hadn't fully articulated, reading signals in the bird's behavior that she registered automatically. Writing them down forced her to slow down the automatic processes and examine their parts, which was both illuminating and occasionally humbling. There were things she knew that she didn't know how she knew, and those were the hardest to write about. Elias read the drafts when she asked him to, which was most of them. "This part," he said one evening, pointing at a page. "You say, the bird will signal readiness through posture change. What does that mean to someone who's never watched a bird the way you watch them?" She looked at the page. "I know what I mean." "You know what you mean. Can a woman in Missouri understand what you mean?" She took the page back. She rewrote the section 3 times before it satisfied her. This was the pattern of those weeks. Elias reading the drafts with the patient, practical eye of someone who understood what she was building but was not inside her head, and Ruth revising toward the clarity that would make the method genuinely teachable rather than just nominally documented. The local teaching continued alongside all of this. Abigail Trout came every Tuesday, as agreed. Margaret Elroy had progressed to the point where she was asking questions that required Ruth to think carefully before answering, not because the questions were difficult, but because they were exactly the right questions, the ones that went to the principles underneath the practices. Ben Henderson came by once a week, ostensibly to check on the birds he'd sold her, but really, Ruth understood, because he was learning something he hadn't known he needed to learn. Frances Loft sent word in mid-April that the cattle her husband had been quietly losing were stabilizing. She didn't come herself, that wasn't her way. But the word carried a weight that Ruth received as what it was, an acknowledgement. Not an apology, not a complete reversal of judgment, just the quiet recognition of a woman who had decided to update her accounting of things. Dorothea Hart came on a Sunday afternoon in late April, not for any particular stated reason, but with a jar of preserved something under her arm that she set on the kitchen table and didn't explain. Ruth made coffee, Actual coffee. She kept it stocked now. And they sat together in the kitchen and talked for 2 hours about nothing that would have sounded important to anyone listening, and everything that mattered between two women who had decided to respect each other. At one point, Dorothea said, without preamble, "I told Mabel Stetson it was the saddest thing I'd seen all fall. The chicken purchase." "I know," Ruth said. "I was wrong." "Yes," Ruth said, "you were." And because it was Dorothea who had never once softened a truth to spare someone's feelings, Ruth did not soften it either. Dorothea nodded, accepting this in the way she accepted everything, directly, without ceremony. "What you did was not something I could have predicted," she said, "and I've been on this frontier longer than you've been alive. I thought I'd seen most of what people can do when they're desperate." She picked up her coffee. "I hadn't seen that." "I wasn't desperate," Ruth said. "I mean, I was. But that's not why I bought them." "Why did you buy them?" Ruth thought about it, honestly. "Because everyone had decided they were finished," she said. "And I've never been able to walk past something that everyone has decided is finished without wondering if they're right." Dorothea looked at her. "Are they ever right?" "Sometimes," Ruth said. "Some things are finished. Some things really are past the point where effort makes a difference." She paused. "But you have to look at them clearly to know the difference. And most people don't look. They just decide." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Outside, the April afternoon was doing what April afternoons in Iron Hollow eventually learned to do. The light was good, the air had warmth in it without the tentative quality of early March warmth, and the birds in the yard were moving in the particular free way of animals that have enough space and enough food and no immediate concerns. "The girl," Dorothea said, "Abigail Trout. She's doing well with what you've taught her?" "Better than I expected," Ruth said. "She has good instincts. Better than mine were at the beginning. She just needed a framework to put them in." "That's the teaching," Dorothea said. "Giving people a framework for what they already partly know." Ruth looked at her. "Yes, that's exactly what it is." Dorothea picked up the jar she'd brought and pushed it toward Ruth without comment. It was preserved plums, Ruth saw when she looked. The kind of careful, time-intensive preserving that was its own kind of statement about value and effort. She took it and set it on the shelf above the stove where she kept things that mattered. On a Thursday evening in early May, Ruth stood at the edge of the yard and looked at what the last 6 months had built. It was not from the outside a dramatically different picture than the one that had existed in November. The house was the same, still needing the shutter fixed, still showing the particular weathering of a structure that had been through too many hard winters. The barn was the same. The fence was better. Elias had improved it 3 times since December. But it was still a frontier fence, not a thing of beauty. But the new structure stood where bare ground had been, and through its walls she could hear the settled evening sounds of 12 healthy birds. The original 8 were in the barn behind her, and Penny, 5 months from the moment Ruth had looked at her through the crate slats and seen something alive behind her eyes. Penny was where she always was, present and watchful, and entirely herself. The notebook was inside on the kitchen table. It had grown too large for its original binding, and she'd had to add pages, and the pages had filled, and she was partway through a second notebook now. 2 weeks ago, she had sent the formal documentation to the society, and Stroud had written back to say the board had called it the most thorough method documentation they had received in 6 years of operation. She had read the letter twice, and then put it under the notebook, with the confirmation letter, with the record of everything else. Elias came to stand beside her. He had cleaned up from the day's work and was in the good shirt he wore on occasions that felt like occasions, which she noticed without saying anything about it. They stood there for a while in the early May evening, the light doing what May light does in the long, slow way of a season that has finally decided to commit. "We should fix that shutter," Elias said. "We've been saying that since October." "I know. I'm going to do it Saturday." She looked at him sideways. "You've said that too." "This time I mean it." She didn't argue with this because the shutter was not what either of them was actually thinking about. They were thinking about the same things, the way they often were without needing to say so. The 6 months just passed, the 12 cents spent in November that had somehow unfolded into this particular evening in May. The distance between those 2 points measured not in money or in birds or even in the notebook pages, but in something else, something harder to name, the quality of what they had become in the process of building what they'd built. There are things you don't know about yourself until the moment that reveals them, Ruth had not known, in November, that she could sustain the level of attention the birds had required. She had not known that she could hold the line against a settlement's worth of skepticism and not waver. She had not known that she could sit across from Garfield Stroud and negotiate as an equal rather than someone grateful for being noticed. She had not known that she could write her knowledge down in a form that another person could read and learn from. She knew all of that now. And the knowing was not pride exactly, or not only pride. It was something more durable than pride, something that didn't require anyone else's acknowledgement to remain true. She had looked at 11 dying chickens and seen a problem that deserved to be taken seriously, and she had taken it seriously, and everything that followed had followed from that. Not from luck, not from exceptional circumstance, from the willingness to look at something directly and commit to understanding it rather than accepting the easy verdict that it was beyond saving. That was the thing she had tried to write into the documentation, the part that was hardest to put into sentences. The method was specific and teachable and real, but underneath it was something less specific and harder to teach, a way of approaching problems that refused to begin from defeat. She wasn't sure she'd managed to write it clearly. Maybe it was the kind of thing that couldn't be fully written, that had to be found through doing rather than read about in a bulletin. But she had tried. And the trying was in the notebook, all of it, every failed attempt and successful adjustment and middle-of-the-night observation and wrong turn that eventually became a right turn. Whoever read it would see not just the method, but the person who built it, the uncertainty and the stubbornness, and the refusal to stop writing things down, even when the things being written didn't yet make sense. That felt important. She couldn't have said why exactly. It just did. "Penny's watching us," Elias said. Ruth looked at the barn. Through the gap above the patched wall, in the particular way the evening light fell, she could just make out the shape of Penny on the roost. Alert, oriented outward in the direction of the yard, as if keeping watch. "She always is," Ruth said. Elias put his arm around her, which he did sometimes in the evenings when they were outside together, and there was nobody around to perform for. And the gesture was just what it was, say, two people who had been through something together, standing in what they had made. "The shutter," he said again. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he agreed. They stood there until the light shifted into the soft gray of a May evening going toward dark, and the birds settled in for the night, and the settlement of Iron Hollow went quiet around them the way it went quiet every evening, the particular quiet of a place that was still figuring out what it was going to become, same as everyone in it. The woman who had spent her last 12 cents on dying birds stood in her yard with her husband and knew, without needing to announce it to anyone, that she had not failed. Had not survived, either. Surviving was too small a word for what had happened. She had built something, she had understood something, she had shared it, and the sharing had made it larger rather than smaller, which was the most useful thing she had ever learned about the nature of real knowledge. It does not diminish when you give it away. It grows. And in Iron Hollow, on a May evening in the last years of the frontier, that was enough. That was more than enough. That was, in fact, everything.